Yes, yes, yes.
Where?
Here at the School of Government.
Video.
DPR, what is that? Oh, okay, okay, yeah, yeah. Great. My friend did that. She did that in every detail. She just left. Yeah, that's what I've been told. The reading list is like impressive.
I've got it connected, don't worry.
Got one? Great. Sorry, if you wouldn't mind, is your jacket pocket free? Great. Well, good morning. Good morning, folks. So, most of you are part of the Blavatnik School family, but a couple of you aren't. I'm Nairi Woods, Dean of the Blavatnik School of Government, and a big welcome to this, the first Technology and Public Policy Conference being hosted by the Master of Public Policy class in the school. I think there's two big themes that the Startup Nation Fellows who have organised this conference want to focus on. And the first is, how can technology be a positive tool for government? And the second is, how can and should governments regulate technology? So you're all here to sort of pick up and discuss those two themes. But I did just want to recognise right at the beginning of the day the support of Startup Nation Central, who have facilitated and supported not just this conference, but many of the Master of Public Policy students who were involved in this conference who are Startup Nation Fellows. Startup Nation Central is a think tank in Israel that's committed to finding and using and explaining and studying and disseminating lessons about how to make technology and work in startups and how to, as it were, marry technology and entrepreneurship. And we're delighted today to have Niron Hishai as well, who's been the Startup Nation Fellow at the Blavatnik School over this last year. So the Startup Nation Fellows who have particularly organised this conference are Zakaria, Ali and Karime Tiscaremo, and I think we should thank them already for having put together such a great conference. And as I said, a huge thank you to the Startup Nation Central folk and the supporters of that project for offering support not just for today, but for the fellowships. So we're particularly honoured today to be starting with Professor Sir Nigel Shadbolt, who I think is known to many of you. Now, I should have checked this, but Zach, are you introducing Sir Nigel? Or I am? Brilliant. Okay. So many of you you'll know from your materials who Professor Sir Nigel Shadbolt is. He is now, we're very lucky to have him here in Oxford as head of Jesus College, but he's most known as Britain's foremost expert on exactly the issues of today. And he set up with Tim Berners-Lee the Open Data Institute with a vision and a passion for how we ensure that technology is both open and used for the public good. And I can't think of anyone better to learn about the two central questions of this workshop today than from Nigel. So thank you so much, Nigel, for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, Nigel. Good, so great pleasure to be here. Technology and governance, well, that's a big topic and a significant one. I'm kind of wearing three hats really. The Open Data Institute, which is something where we particularly focused on the power of data to help transform societies, both societally and economically. But also in my role as Professor of Computer Science here in Oxford, and a group that I lead that researches around the subjects of artificial intelligence. My own background is 40 years, extraordinary, it's just terrifying to even say that, 40 years of research in AI. So AI, I was going to spend a part of the brief intro around, if you like, the latest, shiniest piece of technology that's being waved in front of us all as a panacea to every kind of imaginable problem. And then revert back to the kind of issue of where the promise of data sits within government, because I think that's a nice illustration, it's a nice case study. Let's just remind ourselves, though, that there's nothing new about technology shaping us, in fact, literally shaping us. That stone tool there is not a stone tool made by a Homo sapien or a Homo. This is made 3.5 million years ago. Okay, so that's a very long time. Technology has been in our lives as a species and our precursors for at least 200,000 generations before we made an appearance. Okay, and there's every reason to suppose that our musculature, our neurology, our opposable thumbs and fingers, possibly the coordination and emergence of language and planning, owed a huge amount to our shaping and using and exploiting this technology. We didn't make our technology made us as much. There's an interesting feedback loop in all of this. So, and one can imagine, as you look at various epochs of technology and its introduction and its implementation and administration and governance, let alone those early hunter-gatherer societies, it's always been with us. Of course, the thing we're all trying to keep up with is this extraordinary exponential world we live in. And exponents are terms that are used very easily. The graph there is a so-called semilog. It's a logarithmic linear plot of the power of our computing chips, okay? Sometimes known as Moore's law. It tells you that the computing power available to you more or less doubles every 15 to 18 months, however you measure it. There are equivalent laws in memory density and in communication rates. And it takes you from a chip that had 2,300 transistors on it when Gordon Moore, just after he founded Intel, their first chip, to the something like the Apple A8 on this device, which has over 3 billion. Now, even professors of AI and computing struggle to actually stay abreast of what that will do in terms of transforming and disrupting their worlds. Even though the plot is entirely, can in some sense be anticipated. The consequences of that are truly astonishing, as is the fact, I would say, that, well, there is the Apple A8 processor. We could take a journey on that device. If I can actually find my little, there we go. You're not seeing that rather wonderful animation. It would take you inside the guts of that machine. It would demonstrate that the components inside that chip are on the scale of 15 nanometers. 15 nanometers means I could get about 450 of the units, the transistor components, 450 lined up in a row inside a single red blood cell. Okay, so the problem we have is imagining the scales and the rates of change in this technological world, despite the fact we live in one which is increasingly interdependent. The smart city visualizations you'll see are 10 a penny. And what this has meant, of course, is none of us is a generalist. We all depend on specialisms. Our society is fundamentally interdependent. There's this wonderful book, I do recommend it. It's a journey by a Royal College of Art student to try and build a toaster, a simple toaster, you know, a simple object of everyday use from first principles, the plug, the element, the coatings, and the rest of it. It's a pretty sorry mess, as you can see. What he demonstrates is the exquisite specialization of knowledge that now exists for the most mundane of objects. And it's kind of an interesting lesson to stand back. We all know we live in interdependent societies. As you strip back what that means in everything from the dislocation that can happen if we were to lose through, say, an earthquake, 60% of our memory manufacturing, which we actually did after the Japanese earthquake and tsunami. Those have shocks through the system, and they have so far not been fatal in the sense of the fate of individual nation states, but they could be, and it's something worth understanding. Now, the other thing that's being dangled around, just in a moment, as I say, is the incipient power of artificial intelligence. And actually, I think I'm on a bit of a mission to debunk this. As a researcher in AI myself, I think there's so much hyperbole around in this technology. And it's hugely important that we don't just swallow the latest snake oil about how this particular brand of technology will disrupt and change government, every kind of delivery of public service. What you're seeing in AI is the inevitable progression based on Moore's law, that kind of doubling every 15 months, of computing power disrupting everything. Yes, of course, we're a very long way off understanding the principles of general intelligence. We're a very long way off anything that starts to be remotely interesting in terms of the kinds of problem-solving systems we are, but we're achieving these extraordinary feats of narrow task-achieving intelligence. It was chess in 1997. It was Go last year. I always kind of look at the human kind of response to this. You know, Kasparov said in 97 that he played a lot of computers, but when he played Deep Blue, he smelt a different kind of intelligence across the table. Well, we kind of respond to that. It kind of freaks us out. We think, oh, actually, he's written a wonderful book recently where he re-examines his involvement and what this tells him about being human, and offers a lot of reassurance. And I'd like to offer you that same reassurance. Today's AI is tomorrow's computer science, okay? What we're seeing is the unwinding of the inevitable digitalization of our society and our processes, and some are more or less disrupted than others. And I would just remind us, this tracks up, it leaves off the latest hyperbolic infatuation with AI, but there have been at least 3, possibly 4 AI winters, okay? Periods when the hype didn't quite deliver as anticipated, people's interest turned somewhere else. This is because the general audacity, the project of trying to emulate, replace, supplement, augment human problem solving at scale is very hard. Okay? And even with the best results from our deep neural networks, the particular brand of AI that's being pushed at the moment, a particular form of machine learning, very powerful though it is, it's one of a set of methods we now have in our toolbox. It will be applied successfully from everything from spotting incipient skin cancers to playing arcade games to extraordinary levels. But we do not yet have a general solution to all of the routine tasks that exist in the public service. But what it is being used to, of course, it's being waved about as, in some sense, the answer to the kind of next generation of governance. And you can read the ambitions of nation states that say we'll pour trillions of our currency into this. Just yesterday, South Korea made such a statement, along with sovereign commitments from everywhere from China to Russia to the UK and the US. The fundamentals for you in your roles, I'm sure, and to understand how does this play out? How does this technological disruption, how do the consequences of Moore's law, quite apart from whether we build quite what the salesman of AI would have you believe, what are those likely to do to the sorts of governments we can imagine, construct, and work in? And whether you're a Hobbesian, if you believe in some sense that the first obligation of a state is protection, safety, security, and protection, well, you're going to be surrounded with a whole set of issues that come forth from this technology. That's nothing to do with AI as a general intelligence. It's everything to do with, are we happy that we have constant surveillance, we can do immediate facial recognition, and what are the issues for individuals, autonomy, public spaces, safety, all of that. These are imminent. I mean, this is technology being deployed in different contexts. We can deploy it. Have we thought about how we regulate it, how we come to a settlement with the various stakeholders and interests in that world? And in some sense, these happen by stealth. They catch us up. They overwhelm us. Automatic number plate recognition is hugely deployed in the UK. We have pretty well a permanent record where every vehicle is in the UK on most significant travel routes, and we will use that information as a state on those occasions when we feel we have to. The interesting thing at the moment is that the information space in terms of surveillance or surveillance or a proper interest in understanding who's doing what where is fragmentary. And you'll see that, of course, when in various criminal contexts, the CCTV data is pulled together across, for example, London, where there is pretty well a permanent record that can be aggregated from the public and private surveillance that is on offer. And, under appropriate legal instruments, that can be integrated. Whether you want to have that always on, how you should manage that, what the understanding is of that, hugely important. So that first duty of government. Provision of public services, well, there are all sorts of things being offered, presented, again, some of it driven by the interest in AI, but there's no question that with our ability to image, to analyze the amounts of data, what's called the genomics revolution, or precision medicine, much of it ongoing in places like Oxford. We're looking at a delivery of a new kind of public service that is potentially more predictive. In the manufacturing domain, for a long time now, we've had a situation in which we don't wait for things to break down, okay? We fix them well in advance because we have a very well understood model in an aircraft engine, for example, of wear and tear, what the replacement schedule should be like, what the running conditions should be ideally. And this has transformed various parts of sectors to the extent that in the manufacturing sector, you don't buy, or many people would not buy, a modern aircraft engine to fit to their plane. They buy a service. Rolls-Royce is a provider of power by the hour. There is a service contract in place, and their obligation is not to, they don't sell the engine, they sell the performance, the guaranteed thrust at a certain emission level, a certain kind of level of of air quality, a certain noise emission. They take care of the entire servicing of the system. Now, you start to think about how that might look in all sorts of delivery of public services. What world does that look like? The other thing that I think is crucial here is how we allow ourselves and permit ourselves to innovate. We're living in a very rapid innovation cycle now, where the race to, in many contexts of technology development, is first mover advantage. In some areas, it's not about classic methods of IP protection anymore. It's get your idea out there, try and occupy the marketplace because you believe you've had a first mover advantage. And of course, on the back of that, an awful lot of work that's supporting that is so-called open source movements of various sorts, or large scale, in my world, software depositories where everybody has access to the information and the community is improving it. And what you're relying on is this base level provision of a capability which people then look to innovate. Hasn't stopped people, of course, patented, hasn't stopped people wanting to keep their IP developments close to themselves and not release. But in many important areas, innovation is becoming quite an interestingly collective and crowdsourced effort. Let me just then now perhaps move, how long do you, a few more minutes or, yep, on the data stuff. By the way, just to say, we're already seeing in the data world the incipient challenges from cradle to grave, whether they are actually, there'll be nobody at home in the digital circuits of the teddy bear or the elder care robot there. Well, that won't matter because we'll be engaging with them in very intimate ways. They'll be confidants. They'll know a huge amount of our movements and our dispositions and our interests, and whether it's an AI-powered teddy or an elder care assistant or a device in your home, they won't have to be kind of self-aware sentient systems to be capable of collecting and synthesizing huge amounts of information about all of us. So the question there is, how do we come to agreed and sensible settlements about the norms, the social regulation, the forms of interaction that we think are reasonable and responsible? What does this actually do to everything from kind of child harm to all sorts of issues around duties of care for young children? Where does that go? The other thing that, of course, is extraordinarily in the news at the moment is the personal data analytics market. So the fact that on this device, for example, with an average set of applications, you and I have no idea where this data is heading off to and what it's being used for. And notwithstanding various developments around just the recent GDPR regulations, we still have a very imperfect understanding of that. And one of my research topics, projects in the group is to actually do very large-scale analysis. We've taken over 1 million applications from the Android Play Store, that is where the Android apps all live, and analyze where the data is headed to and what data is being collected. It's a stronger picture of data's destination than any regulator has available to them, and probably any app developer, and probably the mobile providers themselves. Okay, you can't even get inside some of the providers' app stores because they're walled gardens. There are really big issues here about even knowing what the facts on the ground are. This, for example, is the destination of your data, Airbnb, with somebody who's using these other services. This is where it's going, and we can follow this Sankey diagram out. We could follow it out and see where it's going geographically. So when we worry about what we do in the face of these very large data incumbents that are emerging and providing an exquisite range of services with brilliant innovation, how are we to get even a general grip on the policy challenges? So just a few minutes on open data. Berners-Lee and I had a bit of a success in getting the UK government to open up open data. Partly there was a movement, a set of ideas very much on our side at the time. We were able to get the UK government, under successive governments actually, to be fair, to release increasing amounts of non-personal data that government collected in our name. We now have a site, data.gov.uk, that has tens of thousands of data sets. And people are always pushing to say, has this data made a difference? What's the actual impact on this? The notion was that data provided and collected by government, made available, could provide some of the raw material for the innovation I've just been talking about. The AI systems that we're now looking about are hungry for data, okay, particularly the machine learning and so on. So you could imagine there's a very nice interplay. And in fact, both Tim and I, our reason for getting, one of our reasons for getting interested in this work was to provide the foundation base, the layer of open data that could drive much of the technological innovation we thought were important on the web. People often say, well, prove to us that it's worth anything. Actually, we don't have to look at a kind of recent open data initiatives. We can just go straight back to the Human Genome Project. Originally, attempts to sequence the human genome were subject to IP protection. There were companies being set up that they were going to actually assert IP rights over sequences, so-called SNPs, short sequences of the human genome. Supreme Court struck that down, and a famous judgment actually destroyed a few $1 billion worth of investment value on the NASDAQ. This was thought not to be an appropriate use of well, you can argue about what the fundamental nature of the human genome is. It's a kind of a construct in nature. Can it be protected at all? But not least, the consequence of that was the creation of a $1 trillion set of opportunities around genomics, where the fundamental base level data, if you will, our own software code, if you will, the thing that determines how we manufacture the proteins and components that define ourselves, is an openly available construct, isn't in anybody's particular ownership. And just the before and after on that is already a very interesting analysis. So it isn't as if open data is a brand new shiny idea, but what we have done in the UK is led to releases from everything from reported crime, where we were assured by various ministers at the time, indeed chief constables, that releasing data about where crime had actually happened at a highly local and detailed level on a monthly basis would lead to a collapse in public confidence. This is just, didn't. It's had all sorts of beneficial outputs. Everything from civil action groups who can see what's happening through to people who can actually understand everything from insurance quotes to actually where there might be an issue in terms of circulation or poor provision of street lighting. Very powerful. As was the release of data around mortality rates in our hospitals. Very controversial, this. Interesting example of where releasing the data led to a conversation not just about whether the work practices were appropriate. This was about whether or not you were more or less likely to have a bad outcome if you were admitted into an A&E hospital section at the weekend or not. Okay. Well, you might imagine that could relate to staffing patterns. It could relate to all sorts of quite important issues that relate to the governance of our health system. And it turned out there was then a big argument about whether the data could be trusted, whether actually the data, the shift patterns, were actually reflecting what they were claiming to in these and other sorts of data representations. This drives the whole instrumentation of public service delivery, I believe, up, not down. The debate can be uncomfortable, it can be challenging. One can leap to conclusions that then don't turn out to be quite verified in the way you thought, but nevertheless valuable. Here's another favorite. This is flooding. We might be in need of it just recently because of the amount of rain we've had, but here's the issue in DEFRA, our Department for Environmental, Food and Agriculture. It's all about the fact that in some of our key areas, the data was being sat on, or it was being sold for a local amount of money to various other providers. And it just seems time and time again that you make the data, the fundamental reference data available, all sorts of additional services are possible. My favorite personal example, because it's been quantified in terms of economic value, is the data that is now released by Transport for London. Nice example, controlled area. They used to sell the data. They used to have people write applications employed by Transport for London to exploit the data. They made a decision to make it all openly available. They put an application programming interface on it so I can make live calls to see where trains and buses and tubes are. And now you've got companies like Citymapper who provide the best, most efficient mapping through a capital city probably anywhere in the world, given the context. has generated, even by the most conservative estimates, hundreds of million pounds of saving per year. People don't know what all the externalities are of getting people more efficiently around the city, but they will be considerable. And everybody gets frustrated as they leave the kind of city mapper zone and the data's not there to drive the app. I used it successfully just the beginning of the week in Amsterdam. You know, it's a model that's kind of beginning to find its way out there. Give you another example, and one of my favorites. This is Open Corporates. This is a startup that has taken, again, fought the fight, really, to get this data released. This is data about the legally incorporated companies in your country, right? This is the kind of data that in the UK is held by Companies House. Could it be controversial that we ought to know who they are? Well, it's now available. Could it be controversial that we know who the directors are? Should it be controversial that we know what the beneficial ownership relationships are? Who owns who? Where the control functions are? Open Corporates has done a quite extraordinary job of becoming a third-party provider of this information, not just in the UK, but across the globe. If it works, they have a lovely example you may have seen. There was Diageo, by the way, showing us a little bit about the ownership model there. Okay, there we are. So what you can see there is, this is a lovely example of their analysis. This is beneficial ownership of some of the major banks in America. So what we're seeing here is who owns who out of the family of companies from Bank of America. That's nothing particularly, I mean, you know, that's nothing particularly pathological. Let's look at another company. Let's look at Goldman Sachs. Oh, what's that? That's the Cayman Islands, by the way. Okay. Now we can have a laugh at this, but actually what's interesting is the availability of this information at scale changes your ability to have certain sorts of conversation at all. And you may be aware that at the moment, there's very much a conversation in place about what should, could, or ought to be revealed about offshore investments. And it's not all about avoiding tax. This is partly about understanding what the networks are, not least because when you have a financial meltdown, you'd like to be able to unwind where the liabilities are. Okay, let's go back. And a final point I'd like to make. I think we're moving to a position where our technology isn't something we take and deploy. For a long time, nation states have been about building a public and a private infrastructure, something that makes the economy and the society work more efficiently. And we kind of understand that in the context of transport or power grids, or indeed even the distribution of our internet facilities. And we expect our infrastructures to have certain properties. We like them reliable, safe, high quality. I think we're now living in an era where the fundamental obligation on us is to build data infrastructures. Right? It isn't that all the data lives in one private or one public holding. It is that we can sensibly argue that when it comes to our geography, our contracts, energy consumption timetables, many, many other examples, that these are things that we need to think about being held in public trust. They are essential parts of good governance, and within that, there is a huge amount of challenge. And really have time to go into the kind of impediments, the opportunities in this space. We, at the Open Data Institute, and I would kind of refer you onto the website there, the ODI website, Open Data Institute's website. We have a lot of information about the to-dos, the case studies, if you like, the policy implications of how to make the open data component a fundamental plank on which you build the rest of your, in a certain sense, delivery capability for modern states. And probably that's a good place to stop. Thank you.
Great. Do you want to take questions from there, or do you want to?
Yeah, we'll sit down. Shall we sit down? Yeah. So.
Great. That was fantastic foray into that world. Let's open up for questions, and I do just want to highlight, Nigel is particularly rare because of the role he played first as government information advisor, then working with the government to produce data.co.uk, and then sitting on the Transparency Board for government. And I guess as a kickoff, what I would love to hear about is what is it that you wish government officials either knew or did? What should they do more of? What should they do less of from what you've seen? What do they need to know? What do they need to do?
Yeah. Well, I would say this, wouldn't I? But I think we have to have at least a cadre or a general understanding across the civil service as to the central importance of data, if you will. Now, it's not as if governments haven't understood this in the past, variously set up their census bureaus, their Office for National Statistics, but the new world in which we live means this is the currency on a daily basis. So to be data literate is a pretty important kind of numeracy, I would argue. And that comes along not just with a general sense of, oh, that sounds terribly, is that all about computer science? It's as much about policy. So it's understanding that there are some fundamental desirable features of data within government, within society, including, for example, use open standards. At the point of procurement, think about mandating open standards. People say, oh, why is that interesting? Well, it's simply the case that unless you're aware that you have choices to make, so if I want to kind of future-proof all the data held in my spreadsheets, for example, then a good idea is to insist that whatever software provider you have, whatever application you use, that spreadsheet is going to be available in a form that any other spreadsheet application can use. And there are open standards to guarantee that. For example, .csv, comma-separated values. Very, very boring stuff, but there's an absolute agreed standard. It's like an in lingua franca for data exchange across different applications. Same for word processing, same for database formats. So now, would that be the first thing a civil servant might think about? I doubt it, actually, but we're beginning to want to move to the dial to say, when I live in this data world, there are obligations. Licensing, fundamentally, the question around what are the license arrangements for this data to be used and reused? And we had to literally change the entire. In fact, I'm going to be slightly naughty and just fast forward. There was a slide I didn't use that I might have used. Let me just do that. Yeah, there's some public data principles up there. Okay, so there is the bottom principle. Data should be released under the same open license which enables free reuse, including commercial reuse. So there's a terrible tendency. It's a bizarre tendency, actually, for people to take data and think, well, I better try and anticipate how it might be used. I might want to kind of restrict its use in some form or fashion. That may be appropriate for some classes of data, but when it comes to, where the trains are, what the cost of the fares are, it's much more important that there is an entirely open license. It allows for innovation and generation, for sharing between departments, for sharing between organizations who might want to do evaluation of this stuff. Open licenses. We had to invent a new category of license for Crown copyright. All the data that government used to collect used to sit under Crown copyright. The Queen owned it, the Queen's government. We introduced the notion of the Open Government License, or OGL, that's enshrined in law. It's what most of the data is now published in. And there are equivalents in the world of computing. It's the so-called CC licenses and Creative Commons licenses, which are sometimes used. Licensing is fundamentally important. The fact that you should set the default to publish unless there's a reason not to. And this is a fundamental switch, because it assumes that at the point in which you're collecting data, you're thinking, well, okay, we'll just provide an API access to this, that we will expect to have this available. And that's a big switch deep in the culture. Yeah.
Great. So we've got about 10 minutes to really make use of our guest here. So your questions.
Hi, my name is Leo. I come from Canada. I'm a student here at the Blavatnik School of Government in Public Policy. And my question is, how did you convince the UK government to release all these data and to follow that principle of that data should be published unless there's a good reason not to? And I'm asking this because so I worked, for example, in the provincial government in Canada, and I remember asking the Treasury, why don't we release all these data about the status of infrastructure and about waiting time in emergency room? And they were like, if we were to do this, there would be a public trust crisis, and we would be all over the news all the time. And so they were really concerned.
Well, there you go. So here's a few of the data hugging excuses that we came across, to your point. Exactly. Yeah, there'd be a scandal or it doesn't help people, or we'll be wasting time. There are a million different reasons why people might feel they couldn't or shouldn't or might not. I think it's the spirit of the age was very much that off the back of some issues around transparency, particularly around things like MP expenses, there's this new kind of wish for transparency, sunlight the best disinfectant, all these phrases. But there was also a sense that the opportunity for getting some data out there to improve public services was very great indeed. We had a number of cause celebs in the UK that helped. So one of the famous ones was hospital infection rates. We had a real problem with superbugs in our hospitals, and we had people falling very ill indeed. And we published the data on all the hospital infection rates, and they were published as league tables. Nobody wanted to be at the bottom of that league table. So they all started to talk to people at the top of the league table, and it turned out that a lot of this was down to things like deep cleansing, hand washing. I mean, this wasn't rocket science. This was kind of some fundamental best practice that got disseminated. The infection rates in our hospitals went down by 85% in 2 years. It was a quantifiable improvement. So I think that you need to draw on those kinds of examples. You need to recognize that some of those worries will have at heart some legitimate concerns. There was the occasion when we released data on where all the bus stops were. Bus stops, can you believe that was not released data? That was thought to be some kind of issue around why it couldn't or shouldn't be released. The NAPTAN database contained all the public transport access points. We can't release that. Could be used by terrorists. Could be used for national security. We released it, and they discovered that 17,000 of the 350,000 bus stops in the UK weren't where they thought they were. Okay. Because the people were out there saying, you've just said this, it's not there, it's moved, it's crossed to the side, it's been decommissioned. Data's never perfect. In fact, the error rates in that data set were actually quite good compared to some. So publishing it can help improve it. There are many reasons, and in truth, one of the things you can find from some of the reports are exactly. Canada's been on a very interesting journey on this. And in many respects, the innovators in Canada have been the cities, some of the individual cities, and some of the individual states who have pushed, I know, the federal authorities to think more fully about this. But happy to talk more.
Thanks, Nigel. Ellie, MPP, MBA student and student of your great college. Following on from that last question, so much of resistance can be the incentives of the job. Have you seen any civil service departments or particular job types that have been incentivised well in terms of open data being part of the metrics of success for that department or job? Yeah,
and that is where I think things have clearly started to change. So departments who have really bought into this have understood that there's a new cadre of role anyway. If you're going to be seriously into data publishing, then somebody needs to be worrying about that and helping support it. You need groups who see this as an opportunity, not as a threat. And in terms of the quality of the data sites, promoted, it's in their job description, recognized for it, leadership awards. That has happened, and again, I think we should look to the. I wouldn't say it's everywhere, but there are islands of really great practice. You also notice that ministerial support turns out to be important, and for quite a period, we had a lot of ministerial stability in key departments that were pushing this. And that's not quite what it was, I have to say now. But you're absolutely right. The thing I haven't talked about is the other big disconnect here is that much of the data that people actually care about is is local data. It's data held by local government, for example, often not even in a form that is available to be published electronically. It's in PDFs or it's in documents. So there's a big challenge at the local government area to connect that data together with the national data. And regionalisation is another challenge, because every way you think of a public service divides the UK up differently. Yeah.
Hi there, thank you so much for speaking. I'm Tarina, I'm from South Africa, and I just wanted to ask a question around sort of developing and emerging economies and how we use data. So in South Africa, or just on the continent more generally, like we are incredibly far behind in how even the access to data we have. So as a regulator or someone who's going into that space, how do you both protect citizens, not stifle innovation, but also do this within the bounds of not knowing where technology is going? And I say this knowing that things like CDR data and mobile data is actually really like our bread and butter.
No, actually, there are some really interesting examples, I think, in Africa. You know, from Burkina Faso to Kenya to Nigeria. There are islands of activity and been used quite effectively in spending. You know, understanding where spending is going, how it trickles down. Issues around voter registration have been quite powerfully mobilised in some countries. So. Yeah, I take your point. You know, again, you wonder in some areas whether the developing economies have the trick that they had in telcos, where they can miss an entire generation of, if you like, government friction and simply move to a more data-driven model. So,
do you think they can?
I think it's the investment that you need to kind of collect this effectively. So we looked at some examples of this, things like mortality. The collection of national data can be very challenging in these contexts. You have to kind of move to different models to do crowdsourcing of a lot of this information when you have some very interesting information has been revealed. So I know of work on just that issue where people wanted to get a much better handle on what issues around health were like, and they were having to generate the data sets from the bottom up. So that's where you're going to be looking, I think. Yeah. I've got another, sorry, I'm just conscious of the fact that I didn't, the other ingredient, there we go, should have been anyway, yeah. So, I mean, one of the things that we found is you can't just rely on your top-down leaders. Ideally, you need bottom-up and middle out. You need a few civil servants who really get this in positions of power within departments who can propagate, who can connect the top with the bottom. Yeah. Sorry.
Thank you. I'm Umar from Pakistan, and I'm a MPP student here at the school. Something implicit from your discussion and the responses is that there needs to be a systems-based approach in the government in general to be able to push this data and make it available and to use it more efficiently. Do you think that open data is an incentive strong enough for a government that does not have those systems in place to actually start implementing them? Or is that supposed to be more of an internal government transformation?
Well, I think every government has a slight, or every country will have a slightly different settlement on this, and it's much easier to push some governments along this line by showing them success, say around geospatial data. You know, they can. So we've got some quite radical proposals coming in from some of the Gulf Arab states where there is no incumbent mapping agency. They see the value. They've got no particular reason not to, and they're engaged in some very interesting work with organizations like OpenStreetMap to kind of move this forward. In other places, it's transport. It's transport that wins the day. So places like Singapore, they absolutely got that straight away. In other areas, it's rather more sensitive, you know, that issues around voter participation, issues around other classes of government. So it's finding the bridgehead where everybody can get that and get behind it, and using the use cases. Because I think that not everywhere will have exactly the same context, not everywhere is seized, and not everywhere will have the same kind of, if you like, political will, if you like, departmentally or regionally. Yeah. Actually, on that point, regions and cities can be very powerful disruptors on this. If you can't find the levers at the national state level, then often you can find leaders, particularly in urban contexts where the smart city requirement is to be able to share a degree of common data infrastructure. Yeah.
I'm Armando. I'm from Colombia. I'm an MPP student here at the Blavatnik School. Well, my question is related with this question about data neutrality and the idea that data actually is neutral. Some people consider that, yes, it is. Others say, like, no, actually, there are a lot of biases on this data,
Yes.
and especially if you're getting data from businesses,
Yes.
it can be quite biased. So what's your stand on data neutrality, and especially like the effect and the impact this can have in the technologies that are using actually this data?
It's a good question, great question. I mean, it's certainly, we talk about, anyway, it's so irritating. It's not data. This stuff I've been showing you isn't data, it's information. Data would be a bunch of numbers like 103 or 1200. What's that mean? Well, I'll tell you that one is a temperature in Fahrenheit of a patient and one is a blood cell count. Then you know. The semantics of what the numbers mean, that's information. And typically, our data is at least that understandable. That doesn't mean that we know how it was collected, whether it's collected fairly, what the accuracy is, how old or out of date it might be. So all of your issues around data quality are massively important. Any national statistics authority would be aware of this, lives under that challenge all the time. And then the question is, has the data fundamentally been collected in such a way or contains in its essence bias? And of course, the famous example are things like sentencing outcomes in the US, where people are looking at using algorithmic sentence software that determines how long people may be incarcerated. Well, guess what? The original training data embodies some pre-existing views from ... So that's a hugely important question to ask. It shouldn't be a council of despair. I think we have to work harder to collect our data. I mean, national statisticians often say to me, this open data stuff, it's dangerous to the profession of statistics, and it's this kind of Wild West, and there's no proper curation or interrogation. I think everybody is a statistician now, in some sense, in government. We all have to have some awareness of the opportunities as well as the challenges. And where the data isn't good enough, the opportunity should be to do better, to collect better data. Data is always better when it's collected with much more annotation, when the conditions of collection, the methodological assumptions of sampling are there with the data. Often, our data comes to us with none of that information there at all.
Two more questions. Yeah. But I might take all three.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, hi, I'm Sarah. I'm an MPP student here at the Blavatnik School of Government. I actually have two separate questions. The first question is about data held by private operators of services with public impact. Like,
Great, yeah.
For a very simple example, vacancies in car parks.
Yeah.
If there is
It's
an
a great
app that
example.
can assess like vacancies in car parks real time,
So I'm preempting your answer to your question is, when you contract public-private delivery of services, do not let the data go as a public service.
The problem is that some car parks are really private car parks. There is no contractual relationship between the private car parks operator and the government. Yeah. And the private car parks operator think that
it's their
these
data.
Are commercial secrets. So should the government, should the same principles apply to such private services? And the second question is about the interpretation of data by the public. I work in the government, so I probably would be the one saying all those excuses. And I saw one of the excuses, which I would probably say that the public may draw superficial
conclusions from the data,
so
and you think politicians don't?
Exactly. So I'm wondering, what should the government do to improve the interpretation of data, such that because you just discussed about how data collection can be improved, and how about data interpretation?
I'd love to give you the longer lecture on all this, because I mean, there's a whole bunch of issues on every one of those points is a lecture in itself. Let me quickly answer that.
And we'll book you for the 6th.
Yeah, no, well, no, yeah. Do my stint. The issue about interpretability and sophistication of interpretation, I mean, I take your point. It will be. when was it that when was it ever not the case that you release some national statistics and paper X will give it one spin and paper Y will give it another? I mean, that's exactly what happens with everything from spending in the NHS to migration figures, right? I mean, that's always been the case. Unfairly taken out of context, unfairly quoted. That can't be a reason not to release, okay, just because it happens anyway that way. What certainly we should aspire to do is give people a sense of the critical skills to bring to interpret any data they're presented with. I mean, that critical thinking is a fundamental form of literacy that we now need to be promulgating in our education system. The private data, we try two things. One, we try and work with private companies to persuade them that releasing their data may add value to their data, that some of it's not all about sweating local value, that the network effects of their data and other people's data makes everybody's data more valuable. And in some cases, you'll just say, too valuable not to be released publicly, we'll regulate it. I mean, use that with a light touch, but I think you can certainly do that in some cases, reasonably.
Great, last two questions over here. So Matt?
That was actually my question just then about where you see the direction between private and public sector interaction is going, whether it is something that's more likely to lead to regulation, something along the lines of the open banking kind of or whether it's a big huge company.
And
I wanted to ask about general AI, which you described as snake oil predictions, essentially. I wanted to ask why you're so confident about that.
About what? Sorry, I just missed it.
About general artificial intelligence.
Not emerging anytime soon.
Not emerging anytime soon. So it seems, at least, I guess, I kind of agree with you, but I think it's at least plausible that a breakthrough could come quicker than we expect and catch us off guard. So I want to ask, why you don't think that's a very plausible threat.
Okay. Well, just on that, because we haven't talked too much about AI, which is actually quite a bit of a relief in a way. But, well, just because we've always been saying it's another 10 years away for at least 50 years, are things different now? And of course, let me add the caveat that my professor of AI told me in 1981 that no machine would defeat a human world chess champion in my lifetime. Well, he was out by about at least 40 years on that. So why couldn't it happen? The general AI case is that we have no sense of what task transfer across tasks might look like, if you like, the meta-level machine learning that you might require to do that. Even if you had that, you wouldn't have a generally reflective AI. It's not to say you couldn't have lots of individual AI capabilities and a general supervisor control that had something of those characteristics, but that's not what typically people mean by that. I mean, there's arguments about what general AI. I just think it's tougher, and the more I'm starting to hear this slight pushback from the kind of dystopian Hollywood trope that's been the fashion recently. And your other question was around.
The other one was on public-private. I think you'd mostly answered
public-private.
Public-private.
Was there a particular twist on that? Oh, regulating them to release it. Yeah, that I think you've got to take that. I think we keep thinking we might have to invent some whole new class of regulation or legislation to get these issues under control. And if we just take the current noise around internet, social media platforms, there is a very interesting set of common law that we have around duty of care. And when we have people playing in public playgrounds or public spaces or spaces that are both privately and publicly maintained, we don't expect you to come to harm in those places, okay? And the idea of a harm-based approach to some of these issues that we're facing and a duty of care obligation on the private provider seems to be a very interesting place to look. And there is an interesting blog by William Perrin and a professor of public policy recently on this whole topic, P-E-R-R-I-N, William Perrin.
Nigel, can I finish just with one? It's not a small question, but it's the Orwellian state, right? So more and more data on every citizen can be used by a government to know what every citizen is eating, drinking, where they're moving, what they're reading, etc. And over the last 400 years, liberty has been developed as a concept precisely because the government is the one place that can legally and legitimately lock you up, punish you, use force against you. So is your vision of open data an idea that somehow by putting the same data in the hands of citizens, you will limit the possible abuse of the coercive power of the state, which now has this information about people? And don't you worry that citizens can become every bit as coercive as the state itself with that data? I just wonder, what's your protection from the data revolution becoming the ultimate Orwellian state?
Yeah, the panopticon. I mean, it is it's a very legitimate concern. I think that the duty of an open society is to guarantee privacy and autonomy of its individuals. Now, there are some technologies will tell you privacy is dead, get over it. And this seems to me an entirely irresponsible and inappropriate response. Simply because I have the data, I have the capability, does not mean I can use it or should use it to oppress or suppress. So we are, I think, in a serious need of the conversation. It happens in patches, but I'm not sure we're there in any settled sense, certainly in the UK, things like the Investigatory Powers Act, what information can be used for what purposes. And simply by virtue of you having the information, can you take decisions using that information that discriminate or disenfranchise me? So there are different kinds of issues to worry about. Privacy and autonomy, or at least the US would have this approach because it doesn't have the same privacy laws, but what it does have is in the FTC, things like unfair and deceptive practice legislation, it can actually say, you've got this data, it's all been collected, and you're going to use it to determine a life insurance policy on me? No, you shan't, okay? Or you're going to use it to determine whether I am more or less likely to X, Y, or Z? No, you shan't. And there is precedent for doing this. In the same way, just because there is continuous CCTV coverage within London, for example, no, you shan't have a continuous tracking of any individual in a warrantless way. Okay, so warrant-based integration of information, yes, but there is an expectation that my movements, what's happening in my domestic environment, unless in some other sense there's suspicion I'm breaking the law or a threat to the state, that's a private space. And we've got to begin to tackle that because it's quite clear already that in the Internet of Things, huge amounts of domestic information is being shipped out that is extraordinarily revealing of your pattern of life.
So yeah, I'm reminded, so Prime Minister Tony Blair about 15 years ago said, we've now got the information to know before someone's born whether they're likely to become a criminal. Now he said it, meaning therefore we should target social services towards that person. But for me, there's three huge risks to this. And one is around targeting, right? And whether you target positively or negatively. The second is around labeling and the psychological effects of labeling people in that way, which, creates a likelihood that... And the third is we rely on insurance and such like for a huge redistributive function in market societies. And yet it extinguishes the possibility of insurance.
So that's where governments have a role. And I think it's a very fascinating point that where we can load all the risk on an individual, the market collapses. And that can't be what we want in some of these contexts. So it's a very nice point that in some sense, having all the information does not absolve you from having to carry these redistributive functions. That having the capacity to label doesn't mean you should or could, or that you should be able to use it in this or that context. We are used to making these decisions in employment, in a whole range of societal contexts. And we somehow think that this technology requires a different set of response. I think we know some of the fundamentals about what we need to do to assure autonomy. And sometimes it's to not switch off, but not to allow the data to be used to oppress or suppress.
Thank you. Can you all join me in thanking Professor Sir Nigel Shadbolt? That was terrific.
thank you so much. And as you heard there, that was a really interesting discussion about how we can use technology in governance and in government, which from there we now move on to the governance of technology. And I want to introduce Professor Luciano Floridi, who is a professor in philosophy and ethics information at the University of Oxford. And he will give us a brief introduction presentation, and after that he will speak with Dr. Carissa Feliz, who looks at privacy and digital ethics and philosophy. So I'm sure that too will be a very stimulating discussion. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And with the technicalities out of the way, we seem to be okay with the microphone. And there will be a presentation. I was told that PowerPoint was okay. Well, thank you really very much for this invitation. It was a bit of a challenge because the topic was given. So it's not like, you can say whatever you want. Normally, that's the privilege. Now, how do we control that little thing over here? Perfect. I wanted to give you just a couple of points of reflection. In the best of the philosophical tradition, I will not provide the answers, not because philosophers are not keen on providing the answers. In fact, if anything, we are over keen to answer almost anything, but because it would be improper. I thought that this was a moment when we start talking about the governance of technology, challenges, what happens. And so covering the topic here, I try to keep it simple. One idea, one problem, some constraints, and a solution. Less than this, and it's not looking really too bare bone. So I want to talk about how we govern technology by looking at these 4 points with one more sort of clarification. This is oversimplistic. Having said that, it's always easy to make it more complex, especially here in Oxford. Everybody has a big, great brain. Complexity is a piece of cake. It's keep it simple at this level that it's really difficult. So as long as you can boil that egg, then you will be admitted to the master class by that chef. You can't boil that egg properly, no admission. So all I'm trying to do here is to boil an egg. If it looks simplistic, it's because it's meant to be simplistic, okay? Oh, and the boiled egg example is not my own particular invention. Just check how you become a great chef by boiling an egg. So let's boil one simple idea. How did we get here? How do we need some serious thinking about the governance of the digital? The simple idea is this. The digital has a cleaving power, beautiful English, with confusing words. To cleave in English, of course, means to put together, but also to disjoin, which, trust me, as a foreigner, didn't help initially. It's a single word that can mean cut and paste. So the digital has this special ability to cut and paste, so unglue and glue, ideas and phenomena that we have inherited from modernity. If that sounds too philosophical, here is a simple example, presence and location. For past generations, presence and location has always been a single experience. You are present somewhere because you're located there, so you interact with what is around you. You don't interact with things at a distance. There's a whole Newtonian debate about whether you can do that or not. But modernity thinks presence and location are the same thing. Now, of course, for us, these have become two things separated. Meaning, for example, that's what happens to bank branches in the United States. They're disappearing. Why? Because they were designed at a time when presence and location were the same thing. You had to go to the bank to do some banking. Now, since you don't have to go to the bank, etc., the joke is quite obvious. That's how they are disappearing. And that's what happens to coffee shops in the United States. Of course, they are growing, because to get their coffee, you have to go there. So next time you see a bookshop opening a coffee shop, it's not just about money. It's to recombine the location and presence that the digital has unglued. That's actually talking to Barclays recently. How can we offer some coffee? What do you mean? That's the story. Give coffee to people and they will come to the branch. Or law and territoriality. I know that you know, so I'm going to be quick on this. That is 1646-48, Westphalia. Took forever to get to that point. But after that, my place, my rules, your place, your rules. Simple. Meaning there has to be a divide between my place and your place. Some kind of border. No borders, no Westphalia. Cyberspace, goodbye Westphalia. We live in a post-Westphalian world. And I can give you the most boring account for hours on what that means for the right to be forgotten. When I was a member of the Google Advisory Board on the right to be forgotten, that became immediately obvious. If I remove the links from the search engine version France from Google, and France says, oh, remember, this is not Westphalia, so France is not, in a way, accidental. And France tells me, look, no, this is completely useless, because, of course, anyone can click away and say, and look at google.com. And Google replies, yes, I know, but no, it's your problem, not my problem. Well, you know that we're living in a world where law and territoriality have been detached. Once detached, we're not reattaching them again. So when the GDPR tells you, my data as a European will be treated equally no matter where you are, that's a post-Westphalian solution to the law and territoriality thing. Say, okay, fine. So it doesn't matter whether you are here or there. If they are my data, GDPR applies. We live in the infosphere where analog and digital are combined. No one asks, are you online or offline if you're driving a car, no GPS, etc. And we live on life. Now, this online, offline, again, it's just belongs to the 90s, as some of my students would say. We also consider to be data subjects. That's a new terminology that we have inherited from this combined, recombined. So with a metaphor, we live in this kind of a mangrove society. Imagine, that's, as you know, it's not Oxford, unfortunately, not yet, but we're getting there with global warming. So imagine that the place where the river meets the sea, sweet water, salty water, there it's called brackish water. And if anyone there asks you, is the water sweet or salty? They don't know where they are. Because it's brackish, it's both, and it's mixed. All I'm saying here is that this mix and match, cut and paste that the digital has caused a lot of transformations. Now I know that you know, and it's just a warming up. Meaning that the real challenge now is no longer digital innovation, but the governance of the digital. The big planet out there is just a reminder of the fact that we have landed on the digital, and it's not going to happen ever again. It doesn't mean that the transformations are not immense in front of us, and we can have no idea about what they will be. But it means that in the same sense in which there was a world without a will, and then there was a world with the will, and we've been exploiting the will now for millennia. Likewise, there was a time, which I saw, and some of us saw, where the world was analog, 100%, full stop. And that world has disappeared, or is disappearing. That threshold happens only once in the history of humanity, meaning that we have a bit of responsibility of making sure that we do the best of our effort to send things in the right direction. Now, what's the problem here? And that's just a simple idea. So cut and paste, reshuffling things. Well, among the things that the cleaving power has reshuffled is human rights. Speaking to the UN rapporteur on human rights, etc., you get the impression, at least in the past, that human rights are like column of a Greek temple. They mutually help each other to sustain this beautiful society. That's what modernity has told us. They're not like that. Human rights are more like your best friends they never met before. You love each of them, you organize a party, it's called the digital party, they come to the same room, and they hate each other. Here's just a few examples. Security and freedom of expression, Snowden. Security and privacy, Apple, FBI. Privacy and freedom of expression, right to be forgotten. And more recently, freedom of expression and self-determination, Facebook, Cambridge Analytica. They really don't get along. It doesn't mean that they cannot, but it means that if you look at the Declaration of Human Rights, it has no architecture. Just read it again. I know you have, but just in case. There's a single line where all human rights are all identical to each other in terms of importance, and there's only one sticking point outside in the preamble called human dignity. And it's not even a human right. You hear people. It's not. It's outside human rights. It's what leads to the human rights. It's the foundation. So you have one point, human dignity, and everything else is on the same plane. Thinking, all good friends, all columns of their temple. Not quite. We don't have a clear sense of a post-Westphalian, etc. We don't have a clear sense of a post, shall we say, modern or contemporary sense in which all these human rights can possibly be put together, nicely together. So all this has led to a bit of a crisis, among many things, including of democracy. And that crisis comes with some constraints. How do we reinterpret human rights in such a way that they provide a decent foundation for the 21st century, in a world in which we live on life, in an infosphere, in which human rights are fighting the way they are, and in which the digital is still cutting and pasting things around in such a mix and match? Well, the constraints are many. Two I can highlight. One is populism. Populism is properly understood. Populism is kind of an extremophile. You might have seen people thinking that that's a cute animal. It's not. It's disgusting. Extremophile in biology are forms of life that live in extremely hard conditions where no other forms of life can sort of survive. The harsher the conditions, the more it becomes the only organism fit to survive. That's populism. Why? Because it's a special kind of extremophile. It's the kind of animal that generates its environment. So the more populism there is, the more you interact with populism, the more extreme the conditions of that environment, the more populism is the only beast able to survive in that context. So engaging, for example, with populism means exactly increasing the chance that populism becomes the right thing that can survive. It's a bit like talking to someone who believes in astrology. The more you engage, the more credit you give to the fact that you can actually talk to someone who believes in astrology or singularity. The more you engage with those people, the more they actually believe that there's something to engage with. No, there isn't. The way out here, normally, is a long time ago, 25 centuries ago. Socrates already had a solution. Make a joke. Socratic irony. Don't engage, joke about it. That way, you undermine the seriousness of it, but you don't sort of give them credit for something that is worth criticizing. More debate, more toxic conditions, favorable social extremophilia. How can a healthy environment be restored, maintained, if engagement is not a solution? That's a constraint, because engagement is not quite the right thing to do. You really want to take seriously Brexit? Democracy resistant, not resistance, resistant. Think about it. Whenever there's a problem in the world, say, more democracy. North Korea, more democracy. China, more democracy. And when things are not quite so, not enough democracy, which sounds to me a lot like antibiotics. You're not quite okay, more antibiotics. You're not yet okay, more antibiotics. Well, you know what? We have developed an antimicrobial resistance to antibiotics. In the same analogy here, antibiotics is a great thing. It was a turning point in the history of humanity. And yet, too much of it, and we are really creating a big problem. Cows, etc., and so on. So here, democracy resistance, I like to define it as the ability of a non-democratic or not yet or not sufficient democratic society to resist the effects of democratic measures previously used to improve it. In other words, the more things are not working in that democracy, the more you try to use democracy, the worse it gets. And trust me, with the other passport in my hand from Italy, I have a painful reminder today and yesterday of what it means to throw more democracy to it. So what's the solution? There are three kinds of innovation here, and I know you know, just a quick reminder. Whenever we innovate, we do three things in a mix and match. Either we invent something like the wheel, I mentioned this at the beginning, or, that is the logical or, we discover something, maybe we discover America, that's a big innovation in human history, and or you design something, maybe the iPhone, that's the actual blueprint. Normally, every stage in human history is a mix and match of these three things, but one of them is a bit more forward. So you have the age of discoveries, the age of invention. Ours is definitely the age of design. Why? Well, because that's the counterpart of the cut and paste. I'm almost there. Imagine you are, that's the philosopher, inevitably. Imagine you are alone, nothing else in the universe, and there's a single stone in front of you. What can you do in terms of design? Nothing. You can play with the stone, look at the stone, kick the stone, watch the stone, but you can't design anything. But imagine you have a lot of stones where you can start doing something, one on top of each other, one next to the other. Well, it's exactly the cut and paste. The more you cut and paste the world, the more the digital enable us to unglue and reglue things or ideas about things, so not just the phenomena, but also what we conceive in terms of how we make sense of the phenomena, the more design opportunities you have. In other words, you have more affordances and less constraints, which inevitably means that the digital sort of cleaving power as a counterpart, the ability to design more and better things. Now, inevitably, the question does arise, what is design? And that's why policy is so important, because design is a combination of affordances, or you can more easily do rather than others, some constraints, I gave you some, and a problem to solve in view of a particular goal, or what for. Now, you can put these four things in a variety of ways, but that sounds a lot like policy making anyway. And so let me show you the one before, affordance, constraint, a problem for a goal, and it could be just a matter of NHS, for example. So policymaking, to me, is a branch of design. It's a very special branch of design, and it's public policy sometimes, that's here. It's a very practical, sometimes it needs to be inevitably socially oriented, sometimes oriented to the individual, but it's a matter of design, how well you design the rules of the game, so to speak. So back to us. I gave you the foundational crisis, a couple of constraints, and it starts looking like we can't get out of it. The problem is so big, the constraints are so huge, how can we possibly design something that resolves this issue? In other words, how can we move into the 21st century with a project that is worth an effort? And here's an analogy, and I close with this. Imagine I give you 3 matches like that, and I say, well, look, this is your first constraint. Second constraint, I'll give you 3 more matches, but you have to give me 4 triangles. No matter how you put your matches, and you can make as many moves as you like, but that's what you have. You start from there, and I give you 3 more matches. And the answer is, that's impossible. Think of it about for a moment. I'll give you 3 more matches. How can you produce 4 equal-sized triangles with only those constraints? Back to the previous problem. Foundational crisis, populism, a constraint about democracy resistance. We're never not going to make it. But I mean, if anyone has found these problems and has solved these problems once, you know there's always a trick. The trick is to start thinking differently in a 3D dimension, obviously. And once you saw it, like, oh, so silly. Of course. It's that, of course, that happens once you have discovered America. That once you have designed the iPhone, once you have seen, yeah, I was thinking 2D, I should have thought 3D. Exactly. And that's why policy is that moment of, it was so obvious. Once it's so obvious, that is a sign of genius. A solution that solves so much, so powerful, and yet not so visible just a moment ago. So that's what I wanted to finish with. The governance of the digital is our issue today. It requires a lot of imagination to discover the obvious afterwards. In terms of constraints, we have some. One of the things that can make a big difference in terms of understanding how our society needs to be developed, what chances we have to design a proper human project for the 21st century. And hopefully, during the Q&A and the discussion, I will be able to tell you more about the kind of project we have inherited and why that was a great first chapter. We don't throw things away, but we need to write a second chapter. And anyone who thinks that the first chapter is okay and that's all there is wrong. The second chapter will build on the first chapter. Modernity is there for us as a springboard. But if the governance of the digital doesn't provide us with a second chapter, which will be the digital for a decent society, we will have missed a great opportunity. And I'll stop here because I know we have much to discuss. Thank you. And I'll stay here. Yep. Hi, nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. Thank you so much for that very stimulating talk. It's great to be here. So I would like to start by asking you something about philosophy and in particular ethics. I think for many people, people can understand why we need computer scientists in this conversation, we need politicians, we need lawyers, but I think for many people it's not that obvious why we need philosophers. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think ethics can bring to the table in a conversation about the governance of technology? And in particular, what can trained ethicists contribute to decision-making committees in both public institutions and private companies? And should every company have a chief ethicist?
So starting from the last question, absolutely. Otherwise, how do we get jobs for philosophers? One philosophy in every company, no matter how small. And if we can make that a European law, that would be job done. More seriously, slightly more seriously, coming back to the first point, which is the real one. I was amazed myself by seeing how much the world has changed in the last maybe 5-10 years. I think we owe this to the web and then the social media. Trust me, no one gave that part of the body of a rat about this only 20-25 years ago. I still remember my supervisor saying, this stuff is not going to go anywhere. Internet is a fashion. Congratulations. And the impact of AI, philosophy of AI, totally useless, etc. So why so much pressure now? Because it has become something that each of us feels on their skins. It's in the newspapers. Essentially, society has caught up with academic research. But this stuff has been with us since, since literally the 50s. Some of the classics that we read in our classrooms are dated, not from the 50s. So why ethics is so important? So moving to the serious business. Well, normally the answer I get from the British government or big companies, and I work a lot with both, is we've got compliance, we've got legal rules. So what else do you need? Now here is a clear, I hope, way of understanding why that is not enough. Imagine being told, whatever game you play, that all you need to do to play that game is to play according to the rules. And it was like, yeah, how do I win? Well, no, just play according to the rules. Tennis, play according to the rules. Football, play according to the rules. That's it. No, it isn't. So ethics is the difference between playing according to the rules, which is called compliance, and playing well according to the rules, which is called doing the right thing, of and above compliance. Once companies start getting it, then inevitably they knock the door of the only dentist in town, that would be me, and say, how do we play well according to the rule? Because we did everything by the book, but then Cambridge Analytica happened, and that was a lot of pain. There's probably nothing illegal, strictly speaking, in that sort of episode, and yet, big mistake. Surely, lack of trust, breach of confidentiality, you name it, all things that are soft. So what I'm talking about here is, and I'll close it now, is that ethics is a terminology you will not find anywhere else. So just for us, just for today, you can divide ethics into two different ways of doing it. There's the hard ethics that you probably heard of all the time, is what normally mom and dad teach us. Don't do this, and you better do that. Is what contributes to shape the law or shape any other sort of behavior we have. It comes before, during, after, but it doesn't mind saying this is the right thing to do no matter what the law says. Then there's the soft ethics, which says, okay, I comply. Let me see what I can do over and above what compliance means. And so if you are working with hard ethics, you want to change, say, apartheid in South Africa. Well, that's a very hard ethics position. You complain, you go to prison for it. You become someone who has done something illegal. You are going to stay in that seat, even if that seat is reserved for white men, because you say, I don't think so. I don't agree. And you go to prison for it, and you change the world. That's hard ethics for you. Or, and is again inclusive or, you're going to say, well, okay, that's the GDPR, fine. That's privacy law, okay. What can I do better and more than that? So hard ethics doesn't mind the fact that I may not do this, doesn't mean that I shouldn't do it. You may not, and I'm still going to do it because it's the right thing to do. Soft ethics takes you may not do this as a starting point. Okay, if I may not, I may not. But what I can do more on that. At this point, to conclude, more so concrete sense, Why so much soft and hard ethics today? More soft than hard, especially from companies. Well, because companies, especially as they get more mature, the IBM and Microsoft of the world, Google getting there, Facebook not yet, so no, young, teenager, semi, grown up and then mature. Well, the teenagers of the world, in terms of companies, are realizing increasingly that an enormous amount of their wealth depends on so-called intangibles. Goodwill, know-how, reputation. If you take the top 500 companies in the world, normally anything between 75 and 80% of their value is intangible. Clearly, part of those intangibles are values, and therefore soft ethics becomes a default. That's how you get here. That's how people start thinking, okay, maybe we really need some sort of framework around here, or we need values, and I don't mind if they do that just strategically. I do not belong to that branch of philosophy who wants to make people good people. I don't care. As long as the world is getting better, if you do that because you're a complete bastard for the worst possible intentions, you're doing something good anytime. So whatever motivations, to be more, whatever motivations people have to do the right thing, I'm happy that they're doing the right thing, as long as that is the outcome.
You mentioned Facebook a couple of times. One of the most interesting parts of your profile, of course, apart from the academic research, which is fascinating, is your experience with advising many governments, but also companies. And you chaired Facebook's working group on digital ethics. Of course, this was way after all the Cambridge Analytica things had happened, even though we hadn't been informed about it. What was your experience like? And do you think the work that group did might be able to prevent some future Cambridge Analytica scandals?
Okay, on this point, I'm afraid that there's a pile of NDA that I signed, which will prevent me from being entirely open. So I chaired the working group organized by Facebook on digital ethics way before the scandal hit the fan, but after Cambridge Analytica had already happened. As you know, there's a gap between when it did happen and when it came out. So like a year and a half ago, roughly speaking. Being careful about what I can or cannot say. Nothing, trust me, it's just boring stuff, but nothing too exciting. It's just that one of those confidentiality things. I have reasonable, moderate hope that a company like Facebook finally gets the message that going around with the hat the other way around and a T-shirt, thinking everything is going to be okay, is not a policy. That you're too much of a grown-up. You have 2.2 billion people one click away. And remember that on average, each of them spends 1 hour of their time every day on Facebook. That's something like 25,000 years of human experience every day that Facebook should be taking care of. So that's staggering. Surely, no, you better be careful. So the joke that I was cracking recently was like, we were meeting in different places, in Europe, etc., and it was still, Zuckerberg, or Zach as they call him, had already changed the motto of the company. The innovation at all cost, break things, break fast, was no longer the logo, so to speak. But you still found those cards everywhere. And so the joke I cracked during those meetings, like, maybe we should just go very slowly and be careful. No, don't break anything, and go slowly. Because if you have so many people dependent on your algorithm, on your feeds, on what you allow, do not allow, on how open you want to be to what contents, clearly you're not supposed to run with scissors in your hand. You want to run when you have 2.2 billion people in your hands around the corridor? I don't think so. So the hope is that, and fingers crossed there will be more news coming on this corner soon, that the company will accept its responsibilities. And the last point I want to make on this, will also get out of its own bubble. I'm still astonished by how much sincerely unable to see the rest of the world these companies are. And it's one thing to be told, another thing to have first experience of how really they think, why do you think there's something wrong with me? Say, oh, look, no, but everything is fine, everything's great, everything. So getting out of the Palo Alto, San Francisco, New York at most kind of bubble, that's crucial. And if you are that powerful and so inside looking, and all the other people you talk to are maybe from Google, well, surely that is not going to help you to get a different view of the gazillion people out there. Now, this is the same culture that will tell you that our major problem today is Elon Musk, for example, is AI, seriously. Now, every morning we wake up, every morning I have a coffee, there are 700 million people out there with no access to clean water. 700 million people. That's 10% of the population. And you really think that AI is our major challenge on this planet? Get out of the bubble. So as long as we have rich kids enjoying a privileged life of the 0.1%, we have a problem. I am optimistic. I think that there is, for good or bad, push or pull, Cambridge Analytica included, will make a difference. We'll see.
Thank you.
And sorry for being vague.
No, that's understandable. So one more question about your experience before we go to more general points, and then for questions from the audience. I would like to ask you about your experience with the Ethics Advisory Group for the European Data Protection Supervisor. So in 2016, the European Data Protection Supervisor announced this group composed of 6 experts that was to consider the wider ethical implications of how personal data is conceived and used in an effort to lead the conversation on ethics in the digital age. And 2 years later, you published a report. If for the rest of us, well, at least for bioethics, for example, there have been a lot of reports that have been very important for the history of medical ethics, such as the Belmont Report or the Declaration of Helsinki. And this could be seen as analogous to that kind of effort. So if the rest of us, ethicists and policymakers, become involved in similar committees and writing ethics reports, do you think we should model our work after this report, or would you do it differently next time around?
We are recording this, right? So, where does the recording go, by the way, seriously?
That's a good question.
It's just internal, or it's going to go anywhere?
It's being live streamed, yes.
It's being live streamed?
Yes.
Next question.
Okay. So the GDPR just came into force last week. It's an exciting time for privacy. Are you satisfied with that law? What do you think its greatest weakness? And how do you see it changing the data landscape?
I'll probably have to address some of these questions so sooner or later. So let me give you, no, it's a good question. It's good questions that for the speaker. So we will have this meeting again with no cameras, and I'll tell you what's really going on. For the general public and the public consumption of what I'm going to say, maybe I can address both sort of questions. Absolutely excellent. That's what you do. I mean, you corner the speaker to something that he has to say. So the experience with the EDPS, which is continuing now in terms of, I'm now chairing the scientific advisory board for the next big conference on privacy after the summer, and the GDPR in general. Let me put it this way, constructively. It's a good step in the right direction. Mm-hmm. Which means, of course, that there are more steps to be taken. But the direction is a good one. I'll give you one example, among many others, of how the GDPR bypasses the Westphalian problem of borders, saying, we don't care. And trust me, at the very beginning, with that experience with the EDPS, we still had people in Brussels, immediately after the Brexit things, saying, oh, but that will not apply to us. And Brexit said, no, this applies to anyone. It doesn't matter. If you treat in any possible way data that belong to a European citizen, you might be in Singapore. It doesn't matter. Because precisely the border does not represent anything here of a constraint. So the GDPR is a good move in the right direction. It leaves an enormous amount of grey areas, should we say unclarified, inevitably. But hat off to the people who actually formulated the GDPR for their ability to do something that will stay on the shelves longer than many other stuff. So law is slightly contrary to ethics. An open text constantly is a living sort of document, as we say. Inevitably, it will have to be updated. In fact, as you know, you pass a law and the day after you start working on how you start updating it. But there are several things in the GDPR, for example, in terms of applicability of the GDPR to the face recognition software. Well, that was not predicted, not when people were discussing this. The popularity, the ease, the availability, what do we do? Well, we're already having a discussion saying, well, I think there's enough in the GDPR to make sure that face recognition software in Europe would not be either so widespread, so common, so unproblematic as it is in other places, like for example in China. And I think that's a good thing, because to measure also what Nigel was saying before, the measure is not what you can do, but whether what you can do is the right thing to do or not. So GDPR is sufficiently flexible, covers a lot of material, it's a good step forward. Do we need more? Can we do better? Oh, definitely, a lot. My slight disappointment, just not to give you just too much of a pink or rosy, sorry, that's Italian, rosy picture, is that I'm concerned that one of the major goals of the GDPR, which was to provide a unified framework for all Europe, to anyone from the outside, which would facilitate business. Say, okay, fine. You heard Mr. Blavatnik the other day saying, what business hates most is uncertainty. Give me the most difficult rules. As long as it's stable, I know how to behave. But uncertainty, fragmentation, they hate that, quite rightly. Likewise, if the GDPR is going to end up with the gray areas of interpretation to provide a, say, fragmented market once again, so the way we interpret, for example, clauses related to the need to explain automatic decisions one way in Finland and another way in Spain, well, then we're back to a time where essentially companies had not to deal with just Europe, but 27, 28, 30, 100 gazillion different legislations. So I'm just concerned that the GDPR might end up by doing what it was not meant to do, provide a market once again where you go and shop and say, oh, I'm going to do this here, this there. Now, my warehouse is going to be in Germany. I want Microsoft. I want to show that I do this and that. But when it comes to, say, headquarters for personnel elsewhere and so on, it's a real risk.
So I wish I could ask you a lot more questions, but I think it's time to open the floor to the public.
Good morning. I'm Victoria Baines. I'm actually a visiting associate at the OII. And I've spent the last 10 to 15 years trying to get ordinary people to care about their online security and their online privacy, both, I should admit, as a Facebook executive, also as a law enforcement officer. And I think time and again what we've come up against is that convenience wins out, and that however transparent you might be, and you will know better than anybody that transparency is one of the pillars of GDPR, that you can put this information in front of people, but getting them to care about it is another matter. So how do you think we can get people to care about their online privacy and where their data is going?
We need to learn that lesson. It's been a long lesson. It's always been that way. We do not care. And when we talk about education, that's another word for saying we would like you to be different. I heard this a million times. Oh, we need to educate people, which is just another way of saying I wish they were different. But we're not. We're not different. So the first lesson to me, in good philosophy, shall we say, I'm not sure about policy, is take the facts at face value. The fact is that we as human beings will privilege convenience over long-term damage and so on. So the joke, no one gets offended here, okay? This is a self-applied. But the joke is, treat every single user as someone with a banknote who goes to the shop and buys a packet of cigarettes and a lottery ticket. That is your average customer. Long-term damage, it won't happen. Lottery ticket, of course, that's a good investment. That's us. We are irrational, we are emotionally driven, we are malleable. So what I would like to see is not a legislation that says, let's change human nature, but more one, given human nature, how can we protect it? How can we do something such a way that that convenience, which is almost irresistible, is sweets there for the kid. Like, oh, I put them in the shop, plenty of sweets, all free, and I tell them, don't eat them. Seriously. And who is the saint here? No, for every saint, there are millions of sinners. So I like to take care of the sinners, and I make sure, myself included, say, please protect me from myself, because I will subscribe to that particular service. I will give away my information. I will put those photographs online. If it's easy, simple, yeah, whatever, no problem tomorrow. So to me, one of the problems that we have sometimes with legislation is that it seems to be a bit too, shall we say, idealistic in terms of anthropology. Say, either humans are a description that comes from Mars, no, rational, informed, yeah, not even economists think that way anymore, okay? Or they are not, but we will make them so. Education. What about, okay, this is what we are, and maybe we need to protect ourselves. Now, sometimes that happens by imposing laws, by saying, from now on, you have to wear a seatbelt. Otherwise, big stick. That's the world. People have to be forced, we ourselves, to wear a seatbelt, which is for your own safety. And there's a fine if you don't. If we remember this, we will have a better way of doing policy. The seatbelt idea, something that forces me to make sure that I don't kill myself next time I have an accident. And I get a fine if I don't do it. Wow, amazing. So to me, that is the right way, the sort of anthropology that we should adopt. And until we make that particular move, we'll still be in academia, writing beautiful books, nice articles, laws that don't really make a difference. So insofar as the concrete examples of everyday life are concerned, take, for example, the eye-watering fees that, or sort of penalties that you can now impose on companies because of the GDPR. Well, that's an incentive. It may be not improved, but that's not a bad idea. So maybe that's a way forward. And I'm sorry, I know we are here. No, trust me, as a professor of philosophy, I love education, but I need to understand also what we mean by it. And if we mean just, I don't like you, I want to make you different, well, that's a different sort of idea than what I have in mind. Yeah.
Hi, does it work? I'm Niron Hashay, I'm professor of strategy and technology from Israel. So I have a comment and a question / suggestion. So I think you might be kind of naive thinking about the Mark Zuckerbergs as not understanding what's going on. I think they have been capturing public policy for a long time, and they are buying time now. So they know exactly what they do, and they take the best professionals to help them do so. But following your very interesting analysis, I have some kind of maybe an idea or a question. Like even GDPR is sort of treating our personal data as some kind of a good that we need to protect. So why not attribute some kind of intellectual property rights for us, for the personal data that we create? Once you start doing that, you can get quite a lot of mileage. So if you treat our personal data as any composition or creation that we have, there are laws to treat that. And then you can start thinking very differently about the fact that all this personal data can be used in ways that we don't want them to. So I would be very happy to hear your view about what I'm throwing.
So let me get this right. Kind of thinking in terms of some kind of data ownership that could help the mechanism whereby we handle personal data in the world, something like along those lines.
Data ownership, data compensation for using our data.
Yeah. So I think that I heard this more than once, and I'm not entirely convinced for two reasons. But when I say I'm not entirely convinced, no rhetoric meant. This is not Oxford talking. I don't mean like that's total rubbish. I really mean I'm not entirely convinced for two reasons, or two sort of lines of reasoning. The first one is that my data are really almost worthless. Now, last time I checked, it was a good app, I think it was the Financial Times, the New York Times, one of those that you could use in order to see how much yourself were worth, in terms of data. And I think I scored less than a song on iTunes. Because, of course, the value of my data is the aggregate. I mean, what's the value of that grain of sand on a beach? Nothing. The argument, but without all those grains of sand, there would be no beach. True. But people are interested in the beach, not in the grain of sand. So the moment I start being a little bit fussy about my data, there's a gazillion other people out there. So goodbye. I get the point. Oh, but what if the gazillion gets organized, the whole beach? So that's why I'm not entirely convinced what's worth or what's not worth in terms of selling, buying, market-oriented. But above all, I'm not convinced because the ownership of data is problematic in the following sense, and I hope you get this with a simple linguistic trick. My hand, my tie, my football team. Now, that's me talking, okay? So I'm not Chelsea. So my hand is what constitutes me. I don't own it. It's me. So my ownership of my hand is a different story from my tie. I bought it, you can't use it. That's the Lockean view of ownership. Remember, there's a property, the right to forbid other people to use what you have acquired. And my football team, or my preferred airline, I said, well, it's not that I own it in any possible way, like that I tie, or it's part of me. So these are three ways in which my data actually are my data. There's data that make me who I am. And I'm not going to put it on Facebook. I mean, and some things I'm not even going to confess to my mom or my wife. Right? Is this deep things that, unless you're on a Freudian kind of bed, no one will ever know. Okay, so that's your deepest you. And it gets, of course, gradation, etc. Do we really want to have a market on it? I'm not quite sure. It would be like having a market on my lungs and my liver. Not a good idea. No one has ever argued that we should have a market for organs. Okay, so I don't think so. My tie, yeah, we can do that. That's fine. And that's kind of what we have at the moment. My profile with British Airways, I kind of sell those data, so to speak, in order to get gold membership, etc., silver, bronze, and so on. There's a bit of a market already. So maybe we can improve. But that's not exactly what we mean by sort of an economic approach to my data. And the third one, my football team. I'm not going to sell it because it's not mine in the first place. So all the data I share with my schoolmates, in that picture, who owns those data? That picture, well, it's a picture of all the schoolmates. It's not mine, it's not yours, it's kind of the group, etc. So how much, for example, of my data when it comes to my DNA is just mine, or, say, in biomedical context, they actually belong to the whole genetic group. And therefore, they belong to my parents, and they belong to my children. So I believe that there's a bit of a problem here when it comes to data. They belong to me, like my tie, therefore market. I find it very problematic. But as I said, I'm open to counter-arguments.
Hi, thank you, Professor. I'm Karime here at the MPP. As policymakers going into drafting public policy for technology, what would be your advice in terms of the most pressing ethical issues that we're facing right now regarding algorithms, regarding artificial intelligence, and all these emerging technologies, and these big, hot words that we just randomly speak about, but haven't really pinpointed what the ethical pressing issues are and how to tackle them. So if you were to mention 2 or 3 ethical issues that we should tackle first, what would these be?
Okay, well, this is very interesting, and it's actually part of the work that I'm doing for the government. You probably end up this day thinking that if anything goes wrong, there's someone behind all those wrong. So we have a tech and an ethics all-party group at the moment, and I chair the scientific advisory group. And that question is popping up sort of in a very concrete way. The couple of, say, suggestions that I've already made and I will keep making are the following. And maybe just linking to what we said before, get the anthropology right. unpacking in the suggestion. Let's make sure that whatever policy we're going to pass is not based on a misunderstanding of the people who will be on the receiving side of that policy. There is a couple of concrete examples so that you understand what I'm getting. Transparency. Oh, transparency is a good thing. Not true. It's a means to an end. You have zero transparency when you vote. No one has the right to know who you voted for. That's a good thing. You have total opacity. No lack of questioning, fine, but no right to get an answer. That's a good place. So democracy, for example, defined in terms of anyone can ask any question, but there are boundaries to what is required in terms of answers. Anyone can ask who I voted for. Of course, it's a free country, but no one is going to force me to say, oh, I voted for that party or another party, or I want to see what you did. So transparency, for example. That's already a small example of this wider comment that I made in terms of get the anthropology right. In terms of get the anthropology right, human fragility, how malleable we are. I think we are sleepwalking into a context where we're still inheriting from modernity the view that we are in charge. Here's another trivial example. The relentless, gentle nudging that you get from a mindless piece of software out there. Every time. You like this, therefore you might like that. Every day, every week, every month, every year, since you are able to read. 20 years later, the stone has been carved by the drop of water. Just because that little tick, tick, tick sounds innocuous, year after year after year, you know what happens? I read every Harry Potter. Why? Because you go on Amazon, oh, you enjoy the first one, maybe, well, why not? Like, second, oh, you enjoy the first and the second, maybe, and there's not so much damage in having read all Harry Potter, but there's an opportunity cost. All the things that I haven't read, that I never thought about reading. Why? Because an algorithm recommended that I should read the next and the next. The holiday you took, always going to the seaside, because no one ever suggested that maybe the countryside is the best place for you. So I'm keeping it light for good reasons, but keep doing that on a regular basis in terms of algorithms, and our malleability gets exploited quietly, silently. We're boiled like the frog in hot water. We don't even notice. At some point, it's too late. So my question, again, back to the original point, is a couple of examples. Back to the point, get the anthropology right. Don't assume that people will change. Don't ask them to do the impossible. And be careful about protecting people for what they either cannot resist or they will be nudged into doing. At that point, you unfortunately get a picture of a rather paternalistic approach. And I'm aware of that. I like it? No. Is that where logic leads? Yes. So, last point, can we get the anthropology right with a balancing paternalistic approach that is tolerant? Tolerant paternalism, that's what I'm arguing for. But it's a long another day, maybe I'll come back.
Hi, my name is Corinne. I'm a PhD student at the Oxford Internet Institute, as you well know, Luciano, as I am your student. So I have a question about specifically your approach to design. And so you focus very much on the fact that it doesn't necessarily help to change what people want, or at least to start the solution from there. But I wonder to what extent that doesn't equally hold for companies like Facebook. Because at least from where I stand, it is also problematic to assume that they will change because they are fundamentally driven by the attention economy and their data models. So I wonder to what extent, as academics, it's sort of, obviously it's great if they start taking ethics more seriously internally, but the greater question still stands, and that is, do we fundamentally want to do something about the model that drives them, because that is probably the only thing that will in any kind of way actually change what they do and don't do.
Yeah. I think I'm more optimistic about that kind of agents, namely sort of agents that are constituted by people, like a company, a party, a group, than about the individuals. Because I think that once we get together, there's just a little bit of extra chance, small, of behaving more rationally given the rules of the game. So in this particular case, if we were to establish rules that would make profitable go in that direction rather than another, well, company would change. Because they are sufficiently rational agents to make sure that they will pursue their profit according to those particular rules rather than others. That's why I think I would kind of like to raise the level of abstraction, or the way we understand what agents are we talking about. And we're not talking just about Mary or Tom or Bob and Laura, but we're talking about any agent out there. Change the rules and the agents will tend to adapt to those rules, which is horrible, because if the rules are wrong, they will adapt to those wrong rules. So in the case of the Facebook, the Google, etc., I am a true believer in setting the rules of the game on the socio-political side of the divide. Now this, if I may expand for a moment on this, goes hand in hand with a staggering kind of tension that you normally find in any context where we discuss this, rules yes, rules no, etc. In the same context, you find these two staggering, incompatible statements. The same people in the same room, in the same meeting, will tell you, one, you cannot catch up with technological innovation. They're always ahead, the legislation is always behind. Same breath, don't legislate. You could destroy a whole sector. Like, hello? So these two things don't go together. Either we are powerless, because this stuff, you can't catch the train, or we're so powerful, we can actually wreck the whole train. Now, how about therefore some middle ground here? Now, you see, the two things are two narratives. So when it comes back to rules and how do we make companies adapt to the rules, first of all, abandon the two narratives. There is no train to catch. You just stay at the right station at the right time because you know where it's going. So if really any analogy here needs to be used, is it doesn't matter how fast we're traveling, as long as we know which direction we're traveling, which we set socio-politically, I'm very happy to go there as quickly as possible. So if the companies in question were doing the right thing, wouldn't you like to see them blooming and flourishing and say, yeah, it's because we're not quite sure where we're going there. We're like, oh, where's the handbrake here? So back to the point, rules change behavior, yes. The right rules need to be put in place by a socio-political decision that the society that wants to build itself according to a particular project. These are all agents, the individual, the big groups, more or less agglomerate. They are sufficiently rational to adapt to the rules, especially if they are painful. See GDPR with fines, etc. We should not avoid the double narrative of never catch the train or wreck the train. How about deciding which train to take? And in that context, understanding that the missing fundamental point, and I'm sorry if I'm being too philosophical about it, but trust me, this is really the kernel, is that we don't have a project here. There is really no quite clear idea, and that's what I wake up every morning. Like, what's the human project we have for the 21st century? And if it sounds grandiose, well, welcome to Oxford. If we don't think about it, who else is thinking about it? So what do we want to do with our destiny today, tomorrow? What society are we building? So back to your point, what rules we want to set up? Well, inevitably, that calls for a more general project. You don't start designing not knowing what for. Remember the goal. What's the end here? And unfortunately, and I really need to close here, but otherwise there are no more questions, what we are still relying on is an old narrative that we have inherited from modernity, that the whole project here will be okay as long as the state, the government, the policy making will make sure that every single individual project has a chance of being developed legally. So it's not a project, it's a meta project about individual projects, which is not working. Trump, populism, Le Pen, Brexit, any more evidence that this I'm here to help you is not good enough. It's good, but not good enough. It's one leg. What's the other leg? So companies will change according to the rules. The rules have to be designed. They have to be designed according to a project. What's the project? That's what we're missing.
Thank you. Do you think that the digital evolution has changed the ethical challenges that societies have faced, or has it just amplified them? I mean, has it created new challenges, or has it just amplified the ones that always existed?
So these are classic questions. I mean, does ethics, in other words, sort of change or not? And I think that there's a different angle from which to approach that, because the yes/no answer is unsatisfactory. So let me give you one concrete example, like a super classic, boring classic, privacy. Okay, when I was a student, none of my textbooks would even mention privacy as a problem, ethically speaking, not even in a footnote. Okay, does it mean that ethicists didn't care about privacy? Of course not. There are wonderful passages in Augustine about privacy. And by the way, Augustine didn't believe in privacy. He thought that it was a way of hiding yourself from God. Now, what do you have to hide? Almost like Facebook style. So there's a whole world out there. But what was different is that the emphasis, the priority, there was not a priority in our ethical discussion. Other things were more important, and therefore other things were being discussed. So let me put it this way. I think what the digital technology revolution has done for us, ethicists, or philosophers, or intellectuals at large, has to shuffle the priority list, has put things up there which was somewhere to be found anywhere, but not so pressing, and other things not so much. So we still teach ethics in terms of the virtues, and a classic is you need to be courageous in battle. Seriously? when is it going to happen next? That I have to pick up my shield and sword and go. But we don't find that too so naive when it comes to, what we really mean here is, like, for example, you need to stick to your point when you are editing that particular entry in Wikipedia. That's courage. Okay, that's what you meant. So, but you see, no, it's a completely different world, and yet some of the stuff is there anyway. So I would say that I would be surprised if there was some sort of staggering new things that no one ever thought about on the list. But a massive reshuffling of what matters most now and what is less of a pressing item in the agenda? Oh, definitely. Absolutely. Transparency, privacy, and so on. Go for it.
Well, I have a question regarding the right to be forgotten. Like, I'm from Colombia, and we in Latin America, we're discussing now, like, our position towards the right to be forgotten and, like, what's our stand. And it has been an interesting topic because it has shown, like, these differences that especially the European Union has with the US on that regard. But for us, we have our own concerns. So I wanted to ask you, like, we consider that, yeah, the right to be forgotten is important, but also the access to information, because a lot of atrocities were made in a region, and we want always to remember what happened. We want to know what happened. But there you have, like, a very, very particular approach in a matter that seems to be of a global governance, because we're dealing with companies that, of course, are all around the world. So what's your position on, can we have actually, like, universal stance on things like that, like right to be forgotten, things like privacy, access to information? And the position of developing countries in all this, like, which is, like, our stand, because at the end it seems like we are just looking at the European standard, the American standard, the American regulation, and okay, let's try to adopt this, let's try to do that. What's your opinion regarding the developing countries' position in all this discussion?
No, thank you. And let me self-invite myself to another seminar where we can discuss the right to be forgotten at length. But that episode, it's a significant moment in our understanding, for example, of new issues in terms of ethics. Not so much in itself, but because it made a variety of things explode. For example, human rights, freedom of information or access to information, etc., versus privacy or protection of the individual. Now, when I was working in the advisory board for Google on that, I was the one who was trying to put together the two extreme positions. One Jimmy Wales was there, and he was the most vocal defender of freedom of information in a way that admitted no compromise whatsoever. The other one that also admitted no compromise whatsoever was, I've forgotten her name, was the former minister in the German government. And she was absolutely, completely in favor of a radical interpretation of the right to be forgotten. Most of the other people were somewhere in the middle. And we tried to reconcile these two. We didn't. So the document online, if you go, and it's still available, I think, you will see that the report, which is open to anyone to read, has dissenting opinions. So we were trying not to have dissenting opinions. Inevitably, that is another way of saying we failed. But with this note on a side, I think the right to be forgotten, once again, it's a right step in the right direction. And I was very critical, and I've been critical also publicly of the right to be forgotten. But we need to remember a couple of things. So in case anyone was having a holiday on the moon for the past 5 years and haven't not bumped into this. One, this is not about illegal content in any possible way. Of course not. That's why it's problematic. The stuff that Google or anyone else is linking is legally there. Now, for anyone who wants to defend, right to be forgotten, that's a problem, because the stuff is legally available. It's the accessibility that is in question, okay? Not the availability. So you don't remove the stuff, because, especially the original case, was the Spanish court that required that those files to be published in a newspaper. So that's the difficulty for the people defending the right to be forgotten. This stuff is completely legal, and yet we don't allow linking to it. Like, what's your problem? But for the defenders, the problem is that, welcome to the 21st century, my dear. Like, come on, you want to be real? I mean, stuff that happened 20, 25, 50 years ago, and I'm still haunted by it? Can I get a break? And we had meetings with people through the BBC, not through the regular, because that was not illegal, but the BBC could do it. When people in tears saying, I've been put there at the stake of things that I've done ages ago. Why? Because people could still regurgitate their information through the links, etc. I want that to be the past. Be the past, be the past. So gone by gone. And there is a point there too. Now, in the analog world, speaking of how this is all reshuffling, in the analog world, that was natural. Stuff happened, shit stuff happened, and okay, well, it's the past, it's gone, it's finished. And it was very hard to go and regurgitate that piece of newspaper somewhere. But as one of the members of the discussion group from The Guardian said, and it's not my own analogy, but I love it, it says, these days, you never publish a newspaper. You publish an endless front page. Longer and longer and longer. Everything stays there. And because there is no sedimentation of information, everything is always on your face, including that, parking ticket you got ages ago, or that offense, etc. Now, should we have some way of regulating this so that something really doesn't prevent me from having a different and a better life tomorrow? I think so. So the right to be forgotten is an attempt, unsatisfactory on both sides, and therefore a good solution. Nobody too indecently unhappy, to find a course between the two. But the people who are extremists and say never or always, well, watch out, because I don't think that they actually get the nuances here. And so big arguments with Jim Wales, who never moved an inch. So, nope, anything, anytime, by anyone.
Okay, thank you so much. And
thank you.
I hope you can all join me for thanking both Carissa and Luciano for a really interesting discussion, first of all.
Thank you.
And I also hope that you both can join us for coffee now, and we can take this conversation outside without the microphones, and we can discuss the bits that we haven't mentioned. So what we will have now is we'll have a coffee break for everyone outside in the Inamore Forum, and after that we will hold simultaneous workshops in Seminar 1 and Seminar 2. So in Seminar 1 we will have a workshop that's being led by Omar, and Emma, who is the CEO at Oxford Insights, and also a former MPP student, actually, so you can talk to her about that. And they'll be talking to you about digital government, and we will use case studies from Pakistan and also different places that Emma has worked with and different governments that she's worked with. Also in seminar room 1, we will have Michael Blake, who's a chief economist here with Karime, and they will be doing a session on Internet of Things and smart cities and where the future is headed with that. So again, a really interesting workshop that I hope you join. And in seminar 2, we will have Nazik and Professor Hashai, who will be holding a session on the future of digital economy and employment. They'll be using examples from Israel, different places around the world, and also Kyrgyzstan, and we will see where the future is headed in that sense. But coffee first. And after that, after the workshops, we come back very briefly to connect the dots, to figure out what we've all learned in the different workshops, and just to share experiences and learning points. And that will be a very brief session, and lunch will be provided after. Okay, thank you so much. So we start, so 15 minutes for coffee, and then we will get going in the seminar rooms. Yes, 11:45. Okay? Thank you.